Good morning. This is Jason Dean. It is Thursday around 9 o'clock. Hope everyone's doing good. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate the feedback. The last couple of weeks or so had a really nice bump in views and people subscribing to the channel. I been getting a lot of great feedback, and I've been trying to crank out the videos. It's a lot easier, so I try to do one a day. There's a few times where I might have some things happening early in the morning. Generally, my schedule is pretty flexible. I'm pretty busy, but it's also very very flexible. And the way that I do these videos now and when I do them is very different, and it's a lot easier for me to just crank them out. And I've been getting tons of movies over the last couple of months. I've been going to buy new movies a little bit more frequently. So it's just kind of up the ante a little bit as far as, me wanting to talk about them and share, some stories and talk about a lot of new movies that I have never seen. So it's been a blast, and I really appreciate people checking out the videos more and more. And a lot of the videos now are, they're up in the thousands range as far as views and things like that. And it's a really cool feeling to know that there's people out there that care about these weird little videos that I make. So I really appreciate it, and it's awesome. And I'm just gonna keep cranking them out and trying to keep the page going. Trying to change things up. Doing moving forward. One of the things that I want to do more is obviously like the interview segments. So stay tuned for that. That's gonna be happening more. I'm trying to schedule a couple other upcoming guests. Um, and I find that format and being in that space is probably that's the area that I most probably enjoy, and it's a cool way to learn. I get a lot out of it when I interview people. I love having people who are involved with the industry. Some of the interviews I've done, the first one I did was on Facebook, and that was a Facebook Live video. That was the first time I ever did that, and that was with Lydia Manson, and that was a really cool experience because she's an actress in the actual like indie horror film scene. So it was cool to like hear from someone who is actually in the middle of that whole kind of world. So it was a really cool exchange of ideas, and I learned a lot from that. And then I had my really great friend Sean Russell on the show, and that was cool because he not only are we really great friends, but we have a long history together, and he was a real key figure in my life, especially early on. And we had met in college. He really helped me and turned me on a lot of great music and a lot of great film, and made me seek out a lot of great directors, and really helped my development as to kind of where I am right now as far as my interest in the things that I love. So, and that was a really great perspective. I got a lot of great perspective from that interview. Not only was it great to talk to a really great friend, but he also is involved with film, and he is a really fabulous musician and composer, and he's done a lot of independent film work and commercial work as as a musician who scores music. And he had a company for a while that's not really alive or around right now, Audio Verte, where he basically it was a commercial studio, and he worked on various independent movies. One of the biggest things he worked on was Vice, which is a like a political TV show. He did the theme music for that. So that whole show was centered on a lot of different things, but we also talked about his background as far as being a composer and a film composer for film and documentaries and various things. So that was a really cool another perspective. And then my friend Sean, also does many different things, and we have a lot of the same interest in a lot of the old school horror movies. So it was great. And then I had my friend Emmett on Layler, who then and that show was pretty much focused primarily on everything around Stephen King. And Emmett's a really great friend, and we play lots of music together. We also have a lot of interest, commonality in all things horror, and he's a very well-read person, and especially when it comes to Stephen King. So we talked a lot about that, and that was a really great show. And again, it was a different from a different it was focused on a different thing related to movies and literature. And then recently, I just did a show with my mom, and that was great because she was like the person that literally introduced me to movies and film. So that was a real probably the most important person to really in a lot of ways have on the show about my kind of development as a kid and how I got into a lot of the stuff that I love now. So that was really great, and we had a show last week, and I have some more shows coming up. One show I've been wanting to get, I'm still trying to work on. It's still been a scheduling issue, but with one of the actresses from the Friday the 13th series, I'm still working on that. I have my fingers crossed that will happen. It's mainly been she lives in California, so there's the time zone issue, but she's also incredibly busy. She does lots of conventions for horror films, and for most notably her role in the franchise. She's an extremely busy woman, so schedule wise, it's been pretty tough, but still chipping away at getting a time solidified, and that will be really awesome. So stay tuned for that and some news around that. And then another show I'm going to be doing as far as in regards to like an interview segment. I have a drum student, this guy Ray, who is a super cool guy. Ray Leone. I met him over the summer. He had called me about taking drum lessons, and we started taking. We basically signed up in August, and we've been doing it since then. And we usually meet every week. And a few months ago, we were just talking about a few things that were outside of our lessons. And he's a super interesting guy. He's got a really wild story. He's got a great personality, super cool guy. But I had brought up about my love for movies, and that I run these movie pages, and I just started this YouTube channel, and blah blah blah. And he had said that, well, it's funny you say that because I also, Ray was saying this. It's funny you brought that up because I have a history as an actor in working in quite a few of these like really low budget horror films. And I was like, wow, like that's awesome. And we talked about it more over the next, over a period of time. And he gave me a list of films that he's worked on. And during that time, and then I eventually like checked out a lot of the work that he had done in the past. And it was fairly recently. Like his last film that he did was like maybe 5 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago. And I really dug the stuff. The stuff was really, it really reminded me of a film that I covered last month called Suburban Sasquatch, which is kind of like a modern day. I kind of feel like Suburban Sasquatch is a pretty new movie. It came out about 5 or 6 years ago, but I kind of feel like it's a without it trying to be retro. I kind of feel like that's like a modern day, grindhouse film, exploitation film. It's a horror film, and it's pretty gory and it's completely and utterly ridiculous in every way, but just amazing. And it's also part of this whole new trend that I had just discovered about uh, this whole kind of subgenre in horror, where it's a lot of these movies that are coming out are shot on video, and it's that's part of the aesthetic. And Suburban Sasquatch is looked at as being kind of the, I don't know, the godfather of that genre, like being, like that's the apex, the, the crowned, you know the high water mark, or the benchmark where those filmmakers try to be, and strive for. So I thought that was really a really cool discovery to not only had I never seen Suburban Sasquatch, which I absolutely love, and it's just an amazing movie in every way, but I didn't realize too at the same time that there's like this whole kind of other, subgenre of filmmakers that are making these like incredibly low budget films, but they're shooting them on video, and I just find that interesting and fascinating. And there are a lot of them that are new, but they have this characteristic and thing around them and quality of where they feel like they're, movies that were made in the 70s or 80s. So they're really, because of the low budget nature. And when I checked out the movies that Ray had, that he gave me a list, and I actually checked out some of the movies that he had been involved in, I automatically made me think of Suburban Sasquatch and films kind of in that style, uber low budget, uh, really terrible and cheesy, but yet they were awesome and fun, and had all those great qualities that I love about, the exploitation horror genre world, but in a more modern context. So I was like, this is great, this is awesome, and I was super pumped that that he told me about it. And then a couple of days later, I was thinking, well, he's got quite a bit of experience working in this world, so, and also in like a modern, during in a contemporary way. So I talked with him about doing, would he want to be a guest on the show for Film Fanatic. So he's totally down for doing that. So we're going to be doing a show, probably in a week or so. So right now I'm working on, well, this week I'll work on, scheduling something so that we can do that. So that will be a blast, because he's a super interesting guy. And so we'll do an interview and we'll talk all about, kind of his experience in general, but, mostly have it concentrated on his experience working on these weird films. So yeah, stay tuned. So we got a couple of I got a couple of things uh, happening as far as the is moving as far as moving forward on this channel, and trying to do more interview segments, because I really enjoy it. And and it's a world that, and I noticed too, they seem to get a lot of hits, a lot of, with these videos. And it's and again, it's a thing of, I love that interplay during during an interview segment. It's a really great way to learn, and a great exchange, hopefully, of ideas. So, and as far as like other I guess news, you could say, in regards to music stuff, yeah, as far as Quantum, right now I'm in the midst of putting together another show at Ada's. We did a show, a Quantum show, about a month and a half ago, and it was great. It was really a super fun time, and it was a whole new thing for all of us, all the people involved, and then also the great folks at Ada's. It was a whole new kind of, it was a kind of a test run, and you know, we had never done anything quite like that before, and they definitely had never, the restaurant itself had never done anything quite like that before, and it kind of the idea around it kind of evolved to where initially it was going to be a show of where we were going to be playing just Quantum was going to be the featured band. And then at that time, I had, during the last year, 6 months, I've been in contact and I've met a couple of other guys that I've become friends with that are also doing, original electronic music. So we've gotten together a few times and we're kind of brainstorming about ideas of, maybe staging some kind of show where we could have like multiple acts of electronic artists doing original music. And if we were able to find a place or a venue that it where it worked, then maybe start up a thing of where there's I don't know, maybe some kind of residency, because there really isn't anything like that around here at all. So but I know that there's an audience for this kind of music. There's a large group. There's lots of young people that live in the area, but there's also, you know, people who I feel it's always felt that people who live around here have a pretty open mind, and they have a pretty, as far as their tastes go, they seem to have a pretty wide range. But and there is electronic music, but it's very sporadic when things would happen. With Quantum, earlier on when we were, in our first few years as a band, we were in a place of where we were networking, and I was networking with a lot of people, and we were doing quite a few shows with other bands. We did, like, I used to run this festival that was called the Feedback Festival. I ran it, I believe it was 3 years in a row, and I had the shows in Belfast at Waterfall Arts, and then when we had another show at the American Legion Hall. And basically that was a show of where I kind of booked a whole bunch of different bands. It was all original acts, and they ranged from the music that the bands ranged stylistically ranged from like real, kind of harsh noise, experimental stuff to blues to rock and roll, punk rock, and some other electronic groups also. And we did the first festival. This was quite a few years ago. We did the first kind of festival. It was called the Feedback Festival, and it was a really big success. A lot of people showed up. We had it at Waterfall Arts. We had about 5 or 6 different bands. Quantum played. I think we started this. We kind of kicked things off, and we played a short set. And we kind of hosted the whole thing. We ran the sound. I did all the booking, and I did all the promotion, and it was great. It was really awesome. We had a couple of amazing bands on the bill. Great turnout. And then the following year, we did another feedback festival, but we had expanded it to where I was collaborating with a few other bands and musicians that I knew. There used to be this band that was local called Taboo, and they're kind of one of my favorite bands. They broke up a few years ago, but they were really just an incredibly wild band. I always feel like they were kind of hard to describe, but I always felt that they were a combination of like old school black metal meets early Black Sabbath, but on acid. Just very, very dark and twisted and super harsh, but yet really beautiful and really cool. Like they had just this really cool aesthetic about them. And I was friends with Chris and Bonnie, who were the principal people in that band. And we did a bunch of shows together during that period outside of the Feedback Festival. We played a few shows together in Bangor at a couple different venues with a few other bands. And we were friends for a while. We kind of lost touch. Everybody went in different circles. A lot of people moved away. But for the second year that we did the Feedback Festival, we had lots of discussions about, how we could continue this Feedback Festival and what the first one was. And I had this idea of trying to expand on it. So, and Chris and Bonnie had tons of connections as far as like other bands and bands that were out of town. So that's what we did. We ended up booking like twice the amount of bands, and it was pretty wild and crazy. But it was an awesome time. And we had two stages set up, and they had booked a bunch of bands that were from out of town, and then I booked a lot of the local bands, and we had about I don't know, probably 8 to 10 acts. It was a little bit ambitious, probably a little bit too much, but at the end of it, it really worked out, and it was a really great variety of just all this wild music, and it went basically from all day. It was almost an all day thing. It started at like 6:30 and went till about 11, and it just went. And we had two stages set up, and we would have the whole thing was like one band would start playing their set, the next band on the other stage would set up, and then so there was like this ping pong thing of where there wasn't really any downtime with the music. We kept the thing, considering how much stuff that was going on. The thing that was cool was that it seemed like at least it was pretty organized, because the 2 minutes after one band would end their set, the next band would start, and we just kept going back and forth. And there were times, I think it was probably a little bit too long looking back at it, and we lost some people because it was so much music. But I also felt like in some ways it was really great because there was so much variety. And there were times during that festival where there was a lot of people there, and then there would be changeover and people coming and going. But it was a great experience. And then the following year, I did it more or less myself again, and we had it at Waterfall Arts. And the turnout wasn't as good, but I think the quality of the bands was probably the best we had ever. Uh, the roster of bands that I was able to get was probably the best, just as far as the quality. The turnout wasn't as good as the previous years. I'm not sure why. We tried to do as much promotion, but it just happens. But it ended up being a really great festival. The turnout wasn't the only thing that was a little bit of a disappointment. Was the turnout wasn't so, like I said, wasn't as high as the previous festivals. And but that was the last time we did it. We did it 3 years in a row. I After I did that festival, I was kind of feeling like, okay, I kind of got that out of my system. I don't know if I want to continue doing this because it was a lot of work. It was a tremendous amount of work as far as promotion and organizing things, but it was also super fun. I had never done anything like that, and plus, I was running sound for a lot of bands too, which I had not had all that much experience doing. So, and plus we had to perform, so it was a lot of work of like promoting the shows, booking the bands, running sound, and then actually performing too on top of it all. And being there in the place while the event's happening and trying to like make sure everything is copacetic and everything is hopefully trying to run together. And and it was a great learning experience, but it was really exhausting, and I felt like after that third time I felt like I was kind of done with it. But so, and then after that period, a lot of people that I was connected with at that time kind of moved away, kind of went in a different direction. And then we still played shows with other bands, but for the most part, the last few years, as far as Quantum goes, we were just kind of doing our own thing, and we were really fortunate to just find a little niche or whatever, and we just kept playing our own shows and recorded albums and did the things that we do, and we got some really great gigs out of it, mostly being like with getting a residency at Fog for a few years, and that was a really great thing. That was something I've been trying to do for a while, as far as finding a place or a space that we could develop as a band, and we did that for about 2 or 3 years, and that was great. And then we were able to start doing that again this year, after not doing it for a couple of years, and so that was a really great experience. And then we had a new album that came out this year. So then I started getting in touch with other musicians, and my great friend Eric Halsey had this electronic group that had never performed out, and it was really great. And I was kind of encouraging to, he should try venturing out with this band, and because it's really great, and it's he's just an amazing musician. So that was an idea. And then I was playing in this band Bone Broth with my friend Ronnie, and I discovered that he also did this whole electronic thing. So we collaborated together at the CD release show, and we played a show together, and he was amazing. And then so, and it just kind of went from there. And then we, the Ada's thing came up, and a couple other things came up, and I got Halsey to play with us at Ada's, and Ronnie last minute couldn't do the show, so I ended up a few weeks before that. I I had a guy get in touch with me, Spencer Roulard, who has this modular synth electronic group called Method for Madness, which is just awesome stuff. And so I got him on the bill too, and so we did the show at Ada's with Quantum Halsey and Method for Madness, and it was it was great. It was a pretty awesome experience, and everybody seemed pretty happy. And around that time, I also got in contact, or actually somebody got in contact with me from with another guy, this guy Wally, who is the lead guitar player in uh, the Mallet Brothers, which is a really famous main band, but they're also a national band. He's the guitar player, but he has this whole electronic group called outside of the Mallet Brothers called the Button Men, and it's really awesome music. And so he sent me a bunch of stuff, and we've been in contact. And he does all original electronic music. So suddenly, I'm in a place now where I know a lot of people now that are doing their own electronic music, and it's super cool and inspiring. So now, what I'm trying to do now is moving forward is to do more events like that. When we get something set up at Ada's, I want to try to get that same kind of vibe where we'll have like three groups together. And then I can't forget my really great friend Tom Luther, who has an electronic group called Sphere Music. We did a show together earlier this summer, and he's like one of the most amazing people I know, and his music is just incredible. And we did a show together, and we're also working on doing another show together. So it's been really awesome as far as networking and brainstorming and meeting people I didn't know before, but then also friends, in particular like Tom, who I've known forever, and I've known Halsey for a long time, and we've been buddies. And then meeting a few other people fairly recently, like through Ronnie and Spencer and Wally, that all do electronic music. And so it's pretty awesome. So moving forward, that's something I really want to do. I really want to, you know, ideally, I'd like to find a place where we could do, like a residency, like a bi-monthly thing, even where we could showcase these guys and do shows together and change up the lineups a little bit and mix things up. But all of a sudden, there's like this whole pool of all of these great electronic groups, and they're all pretty local. So I want that to be the focus, and and it's really inspiring for me personally. So I'm working on together another show for Quantum around that. So stay tuned for that. I'm really excited about the prospects of that, and then also moving forward to do more things like that. So that will be something that will be really exciting. So stay tuned for that. So this brings me to the main topic of today's show. This I like to try to change things up and bring some different flavors and try to talk about various different kinds of films and genres, and try to change the format a little bit, just trying to give a little bit of variety. So I had this idea of talking about a show, doing a show on Stanley Kubrick, who for me, I have a long, super incredibly long history of being a fan, and aside from being one of the greatest, I feel easily one of the greatest filmmakers ever. He's personally always been a real inspirational figure for me, even outside of the quote unquote the film world. Just his whole like way of creating his art, and kind of the way he captured images. So and so it's always been, outside of just being a huge fan of his work, I've just always found him to be an incredibly inspirational, character. I've talked about that in other shows of like certain people and figures that are, I feel for me have always been a huge source of inspiration. I've talked a lot about figures like Anton LaVey, Joseph Campbell. I've talked about Bruce Lee. I've talked about Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick is one of them. And then also Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. And also Japanese, one of my other all time favorite directors, Akira Kurosawa, famous Japanese director. I would say like that whole group of writers and filmmakers and just overall brilliant thinkers and also incredibly. I regard them as like the kind of the most. There's so many figures in history, but I regard that group of people as being the most uh, profoundly inspirational for me. Being whether it's like a personal philosophy, and obviously had has had a real deep impact on me, on my like artistic, on my for my artistic ideas and my vision. Huge sources of inspiration, and outside of that, just like everyday, like the as far as living and breathing and my general philosophy, how I kind of operate for the most part is totally inspired by all of those great group of people. And so I was like, okay, I want to do a show on Stanley Kubrick, and so here it is. So yeah, Stanley Kubrick. The first time I came across Stanley Kubrick, and again, it goes back to many years ago. The first time, the first movie I ever saw of Stanley Kubrick's was The Shining, and that movie still remains for me to be like easily one of the top 5 or top 10 films of all time. And also The Shining is also a movie that I feel is like easily one of my top 5 or 10 horror films of all time. But I remember as a kid, that was the first movie I saw, and I remember it just terrified me. And I've seen that movie probably thousands of times. And I remember in particular, like the first, and it's still an experience that I get when I see that film, The Shining. But I remember in particular when the shower scene, when Jack Nicholson's character, goes to one of the rooms, and there's a woman in the bathtub, and it's revealed that she's actually like more or less a ghost, and she's actually at first she's this incredibly young, attractive woman, but the closer that he gets, or she gets to him, you realize that she's like this kind of like this rotting corpse. And to me, that's like one of the most terrifying scenes ever captured on the big screen, and it's just so incredibly creepy and haunting. And I remember when I first saw that movie, I almost couldn't get through it. I almost had to turn it off. And I probably saw The Shining for the first time when I was, probably in high school, if not before. And that image just has always stuck with me, and that film has always stuck with me for years and years. And when I was in college, like I've talked about, my friend Sean Russell, he was a huge Kubrick fan, and I wasn't at that time. Leading up to college, I hadn't really seen any other Kubrick films before that. I was aware of them, but I hadn't really spent any time on like learning about Stanley Kubrick as a director himself, and checking out his body of work. But my friend Sean Russell, who I did a show with him and I talked a lot about him. He was a huge fan, so he turned me on. He basically like told me about all of the films that he had done up until that point, and so and I loved The Shining so much, even at that point, up until that point, that I was like, okay, I gotta check out more of his films, and you know, so I was in my 20s at that time, and over the span of a couple of years, I started to seek out a lot of his films, and I remember seeing like movies like Paths of Glory, the original Lolita, um, so many great films. Doctor Strangelove. I Eyes Wide Shut, which I was the only Kubrick movie I got to see in the theater, unfortunately. But I did get to see that in the theater, and that movie was the last movie that he had directed before he passed away. Barry Lyndon's another one. Spartacus, um, Clockwork Orange, um, just so many great films. And I remember in college I had a roommate who was a really big fan of the book Clockwork Orange, and I had never seen the film at that time or read the book. And I remember in college, my roommate at the time had told me about the book, and he said you should really read this. And it was so dense and so thick that I couldn't really get through it. I liked it, but I couldn't really get through it all. And I knew the film was really great. He also owned the film, and so I ended up borrowing the movie from him. And oh yeah, I can't forget another great, fantastic movie, Full Metal Jacket. Just an amazing movie. Probably my favorite, uh, besides Apocalypse Now, as far as a movie that deals with war. But so my roommate had let me borrow. He gave me a copy. He had it on DVD of Clockwork Orange, and I had a group of friends at the time, and we used to party all the time and hang out, and it was a little like, I don't know, it was probably 5 to 7 guys, and we used to go, and hang out after class or like stay up late at night, on the weekends and party and all that stuff, and sometimes we'd watch movies. And I remember nobody in my group, and I hadn't seen it. Nobody had seen. None of us had seen A Clockwork Orange. So I remember on a whim, I had the movie, and we got really high, and we were drunk, and I was like, hey, I got this movie. We should watch this now. And we went over to my friend's dorm, and he had this really nice system. He had a PA in his room, and he had it all hooked up to a TV, and so the sound was really great. So we watched the DVD, and we were really high and kind of out of our minds, and it just totally like destroyed us. We were just like, I couldn't believe it. Like I had never seen anything so impactful and kind of disturbing at the time. It still is, but very a really great contemporary kind of look at control, and through the state. And so that movie just completely like destroyed me in a lot of good ways. And everybody was freaking out. Everybody was just like, I don't know what the hell. Everybody was just tripping out. They like, what the hell did we just watch? And we were because we were this in the state of mind that we were in, and it was a trip. So after that, after I got out of college, I became a huge Kubrick fan, and I started seeking out all these films. I around that time I started buying lots of movies, DVDs. I spent some money on buying a sound system, a subwoofer. Got a pretty good DVD player, surround sound speakers. I guess it was like my first kind of man cave, and I started buying all the Kubrick movies, and then the other one that I fell in love with, and I've also seen, which I can't forget, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. One of the most incredible movies ever, and that was another film that I got totally obsessed with. I used to watch constantly, and I just and I had read the original Nabokov novel Lolita, and then I remember watching Kubrick's adaptation of that, and I was like, wow, like this is just such an incredible movie. And since then, I've realized that like that film, I feel in Kubrick's body of work is one of the more films that's maybe kind of underrated. I feel for me that's one of my favorites. Very controversial book, very controversial subject matter, because mostly the story is centered around a guy who's essentially like a pedophile, and so it's a very taboo subject. And I remember even, but it's actually one of my favorite books. And I remember giving that book to a friend, and she couldn't read it. She got a few chapters in, and she's like, "This is vile and disgusting," and she gave it back to me. So it's a very controversial subject and movie, and considering when that movie and that book came out during that period, it's just like, you know, probably in some regards like that was like the height of American conservatism in the 50s and early 60s. So but one of my favorite Kubrick films. And so since then, during that period, I became obsessed with Kubrick, and then I've talked about my great friend Charlie Hendrick, who was also, a real pivotal, played a real pivotal role in turning me on to all kinds of movies. He was really into Kubrick big time. So I started, during that time, I started buying DVDs pretty regularly. It was the first time I was probably like 22 or so. I started to actually buy DVDs, and I was like accumulating, different titles. I bought a bunch of Kubrick movies, and I started, it was like the first time I kind of started putting together a movie collection. And then I had about, 20, 30 movies to start, and those were like kind of the movies I would watch. Other movies that I bought, like at that time, were like, movies like Alien, Ridley Scott's second movie. Blade Runner was another one, and so I was starting to accumulate this collection, and that's kind of where the bug, I first got bit by the bug as far as being looking at films as a more serious thing and a deeper source of enjoyment, and and then I just got more and more well versed and kind of obsessed with Kubrick, and and now I can regard him as just being, I mean, he's possibly my favorite filmmaker, probably my favorite filmmaker. I've talked about that in other shows, but like way back when, I did a show on Facebook about kind of my all-time favorite movie, and it still is overall my favorite film of all time, and that's Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. That's my all-time favorite movie. I've seen that movie probably more than any other movie uh, in my history, and that's pretty much my all-time favorite movie. That's one of those movies where I own it and I've seen it a bazillion times on DVD and whatnot, and but it's one of those movies that I remember growing up. It would be a movie that would be shown around the holidays, like especially around Thanksgiving, Christmas time. It was always on cable, and even to this day, if I'm over my folks' house or somewhere and that movie is playing, that's happened many times where like I'll go over my folks' place for like Thanksgiving or whatever, and that movie will be playing on the background because my folks are also they're huge fans of that movie. That's one of those movies, no matter where it's at, and it's like a 3 hour movie. No matter where it's at, the minute it's on, I can't stop looking at it. I have to watch it from it until it's over, no matter where I've picked it up at. It's one of those things, and I kind of feel that same kind of attraction to Kubrick. Like I would say overall, he's probably my favorite director of all time. Just biggest as far as icons in film history. He's like my biggest inspiration, and he has such an incredibly unique history. The thing that makes Kubrick, I feel, Kubrick is just, and obviously everybody, people and artists, when they tend to leave a mark, they're that tends to happen because they're bringing something really special, and something that's like long lasting, and it's obviously due to maybe their unique history or how they create their work or their inspirations. But I feel like with Stanley Kubrick, very very incredible, such a unique way, and such a interesting path that he was on, and also like the fact too that he got into filmmaking under really unusual circumstances, but then also kind of later in life. Where a lot of filmmakers, grow up with an interest, from a young age, from like making home movies, um, and then if they're really passionate about it, it continues to where they're making, they make movies with their friends, and then maybe they eventually go to film school, and then they make projects, for college and film school, and then eventually they move into creating their own features and so forth. Like their whole background is filmmaking. With Stanley Kubrick, he had no prior history or even interest in filmmaking before he directed his first film. So very very unique. And Stanley Kubrick's like history was basically he was a New Yorker. He lived in New York his whole life. The last 20 years of his life or so, he moved to England. When he became a real established director and a titan in the film industry, he eventually moved to England and lived in England for the rest of his life. Um, but all before that, he lived in New York, and his history was super super wild because originally he was a photographer. He went to photography school, and he eventually was the lead photographer for Look magazine, which at the time in New York in the like early '50s, maybe late '40s, but in the mid to late '50s, Look magazine was like the premier kind of photography magazine. That was like regarded as like, the uh, the force for magazines in regards to photography. And Stanley Kubrick was like the main photographer for that magazine. So he made his living as a photographer for a long time, but even before that, uh, he was also a professional chess player. And the way I discovered a lot of these things about his career and his like the way he started, my friend Charlie Hendrick, who I just mentioned, he he had a bunch of. I'm not sure how he acquired them, but I think he got them online. I haven't been able to find them since he gave them to me, which is kind of interesting, even on YouTube. But he had when he saw that when Charlie saw that I was really becoming a serious Kubrick fan. We would hang out a lot of the times and watch a lot of his films at his house. 2001, Space Odyssey, Lolita, Passive Glory. We watch a lot of those films at his house. But I remember around that time he sent me. He's like, "Yeah, I have these interviews with Stanley Kubrick," and I was like, "Oh wow!" And there's, so he sent me these. He gave me these interviews with Kubrick that are a few of them are a couple hours long, and it was during his early, you know, development as very. These interviews were conducted in like really the early stage of his career, and super fascinating, super interesting. And he was talking about how before he got his job as a photographer at Look magazine, he had studied photography for a long time and I believe went to school to become a professional photographer, but he wasn't making a living doing that. And what the way he was making his living was basically he was a full time chess player in Central Park, and basically he became over a period of years he became like a master chess player, and he would sit in the interview. He was talking about how he would go to Central Park every day and be in the park for hours all day into the night, where he would just play chess all day into the night. And he eventually got to be like this master player, and he was able to like make a living just doing that as a chess player. and I just thought that was fascinating. And over a period of time, when I got really into his films, I started to really see the culmination of like his background in a lot of his films, particularly around his visual sense from his photography background, but then also his the strategy he would use in his films, and the the scope of and the level of detail. And I kind of started to see where I felt like I could see this his influences of not only his photography background, but then also his chess ability. You know, where and the way his mind would work, and a lot of, you know, with the use of like being very strategic of where one shot would lead to the next, or even how you frame a shot. And I felt like I got the sense that that's possibly where that was coming from, was from his background being a professional chess player. Totally unique and interesting. And I started to kind of see that over time, or got that sense after, you know, watching a lot of his films. And I always thought that was super fascinating. And and then like after that period of him being a chess player, he became you know, he became a photographer, and then he got this really great job as the lead photographer at Look magazine, and he did that for quite a few years, and he was like traveling all around the country and even over to Europe doing these photography shoots for various models and celebrities and various events. You know, so and the way he got into film is yet again just something I just find so interesting and fascinating. During this time, Stanley Kubrick was living in New York, and you know, like, again, like I said, he most of his career, especially in the early part of his life, he lived in Manhattan. So during that time, he had a close friend of his that was a filmmaker, and his friend, I believe, was going to NYU, New York University, and and he was a filmmaker going to NYU to basically become a filmmaker, and it was a film school. And his friend, Stanley Kubrick's friend, was making lots of kind of, you know, low budget independent films, and you know, and he, you know, had been doing this for quite a while, and he was friends with with Stanley Kubrick for a long time, and he had invited Stanley Kubrick to go with him to this event at the college, because the event was basically going to be a movie event, and they were going to be showing all of the shorts and all of the films that all of the students had done, and it was going to be basically all the students, and it was going to be like this little mini festival. So Stanley Kubrick's friend invited him, say, "Hey, you want to come to see the show, and you can, you know, see what all my fellow students are doing and what I'm doing and what we're doing as far as like our as far as in regards to what kind of films we're making." And at that time, Stanley Kubrick had no. And he said in this interview and other interviews I've said, he had no like real interest in film. He had no real. I don't even. He never really even talked. As far as I read in interviews with him too, he never really indicated even that he had an interest in films. Like he had never really seen a whole lot of films when he was a kid. He never really went to the movies. He was very much more into. He had an early attraction to photography, and that's kind of what, you know, what his focus was. But from everything I've gathered up until that point, he had never had any kind of interest in film. So, which I always find just amazing, because he was like, you know, in his mid 20s at that point, I believe. So, and he had a career. He had, or you know, already established career with being a photographer at Look magazine. So he agreed, and he went with his friend to go see all of these films that were being shown. And then in this interview, Stanley Kubrick said that when he left, and he said he went to the show, and he sat through all of the student films. And he said that when he left there, he had this overwhelming sense of where he was just like really disappointed with. He didn't. He said, basically said he didn't like any of the films that he saw. He thought they were really poorly done, and they were not of any real quality. And he said that after he left there, he felt like I could make anything better. I can make a better film than any of these guys combined. And that's what started his career. So, and I just when I when I heard that, I thought that was just mind blowing. Like that's how he started as a filmmaker, and I just thought that was, one of the most interesting uh, ways, I guess, a filmmaker could be brought into the film world, or develop an interest. So unusual. So he basically left there, and he was like, I can make something better than any of these guys. I can make a better film. So after that, that's what started his career, and since then, I mean, it's just legendary. Um, and he always had this reputation of being, um, as a filmmaker, he always had this reputation of being a really hard person to work with, and that he would just push people to basically, to to insanity, And Stanley Kubrick was notorious for doing many takes. I believe it was like one of the most documented stories around that is like when he directed The Shining. And there were stories of where when he was working with Shelley Duvall during that film, that there was something like 100 to 150 takes, and and he was notorious also for a lot of his other films of where he would just do numerous takes um, of all these scenes, so the film process would be incredibly long and and incredibly brutal. And he was super, at times, I guess, tyrannical to a lot of his actors. But also, that being said, I've seen lots of interviews with people who've worked with him, and they just had so much respect for him that they felt like, you know, like even one of the biggest stories of things that have gotten the most coverage around that kind of idea, or the way Kubrick would work, was with Shelley Duvall in The Shining. There's this amazing documentary that Kubrick's daughter actually made of the movie, and in the scene you see him kind of berating and just like kind of emotionally destroying Shelley Duvall over this one scene that they're trying to do, and they've done like, I don't know, something like 50 to 100 takes, and it's clearly not what he wants, and she's like, basically a shell of a human. She's like crying, and she's like broken, and then eventually they get the take, and then and then the rest is history, and they made this masterpiece. But and it's hard to watch, and you see how meticulous he was. But there's that balance factor. Like, obviously, at the end of the day, he created this work that is unprecedented and untouchable. But the interesting thing in that documentary is there is a later interview with Shelley Duvall, after you see her go through this horrible kind of traumatic process. She like reflected, when she would talk about Kubrick and her relationship with Stanley Kubrick. She said that he was, that was also on one side of the coin, it was like the hardest thing she ever had to go through. But then she also felt like it was the greatest thing she ever went through, and that she came away from that situation, as traumatic as it was and as hard as it was, um, having more respect for him than ever, and saying that that was the best role for her ever in her career, and he was the greatest filmmaker that she ever had worked with. And if it came up again for her to work with him again, she would do it in a heartbeat. So, really interesting. And but Kubrick often is uh, talked about in that light of being such a tyrannical personality on set. But at the same time, I felt like, everything that I've seen and heard about, you know, actors or interviews I've seen with actors that have worked with him all have such high regards for him, because they realize that he was a genius. So we had to kind of go through this, we had to go through this process of where there was a little bit of fire and brimstone in order to create this incredible body of work. And he also, Stanley Kubrick also worked a lot of the crew that he worked with on his films. He pretty much used the same crew for years on virtually every one of his films. So that says a lot too. The only film I got to see of his before he passed away was Eyes Wide Shut. And Eyes Wide Shut is one of my favorite Kubrick films. I got to see that in the movies, and that was under a very strange circumstance because I was really excited to see that film. By that point, when that film was announced, I just thought I was a huge, huge Kubrick fan at that point. And it was announced that he was coming out with this new movie, and then he had passed away. I think it was like 2 weeks before the film came out, so it was a very sad time and kind of melancholy. But I remember going to see that when it opened, and it was a wild experience because I remember when I got to the theater, it was a packed theater, and there was this electricity in the air. This movie was so no one knew really what this film was going to be about. It looked like the trailers at the time showed very little to a degree, but it looked incredibly, I know, just so mysterious uh, and you just were perplexed as to what this film was about and what it could be. And I remember going to the theater and seeing it in a packed theater, and there was this buzz in the air, and people were really excited to see it. And especially I think there was this a bigger part of the population because of Stanley Kubrick had just passed away. So I think it increased people's desire to see this film even more. And plus there was lots of history around Eyes Wide Shut, where that movie, I believe too, that film had been like the longest, one of the longest films for him to make. It had, it was over a span of a few years, and he hadn't directed a film in quite a few years before that. So there was all of this anticipation, and plus the trailers and whatnot, revealed this film to look, incredibly mysterious, and you were like, it looked amazing and incredible and magical, but you were completely perplexed as to what this film was going to be about. And plus, it starred Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman at the time, who were like two of the biggest actors, and they were a married couple. And I remember going to the theater, and there was like this electricity in there. Everybody was talking, and there was this buzz in the air. And I remember watching the movie, and it was a packed theater, and the movie Eyes Wide Shut is fairly long. It's close to 3 hours, and I remember not one person got out of their seat the entire time. Not one person talked the entire time. There was nothing. Everybody was just glued to the screen the entire time. And then when the movie ended, and it has this incredibly mysterious ending, nobody got out of their seat, and nobody said anything. It was so strange because when we got there, I went with one or two friends. There was all this buzz in here, and people were chatting away, and talking. And once that film started, everybody, you could hear a pin drop. It was pretty wild. And then when the film ended, it was like pure silence, and people were just like, I feel like nobody knew how to react because they never really. I mean, from my perspective, I never really seen anything like that before, and I was just like, there's so many questions, and I think I know what it was about, but there's so many things to kind of think about, and it was just like, wow, it was an experience, and it was definitely one of the best like film going experiences because I felt like everybody was in that zone of where they were absorbing what they had just seen, and it was kind of intense, and you could feel that. You could feel like this weight. Um, just amazing. And that, unfortunately, was the last movie he'd ever done. And one of the things that, getting back to Stanley Kubrick being not only my favorite filmmaker, but personally just being a huge source of personal inspiration in my everyday life. Especially with any of the crazy or weird artistic things that I try to do, with quantum or whatever it is, and just overall general life philosophy. There, around the time, it was actually around the time Eyes Wide Shut was coming out. It was actually a few weeks, I believe, or a month or two before Stanley Kubrick had passed away. He was given, I believe it was the Lifetime Achievement Award, and there was a whole big ceremony that they had in Hollywood for Stanley Kubrick. He died relatively young. I think he was like in his early 70s, but he was in really good shape, and he, was really active and very much alive. But he, I believe it was the Lifetime Achievement Award. It was held in California, in Hollywood, and they did this big presentation for to him, and giving Kubrick this huge award for just this amazing legacy that he created through his films. And he did this. He came up and gave this interview or a speech, and it was always for me, one of the most inspirational things I've ever heard. Because in the interview, he was talking about his career and everything, but he talked about one of the things that I thought was just is one of the most inspirational things, and really for me at sums up, or gets at the heart of the source, as far as how I feel what Kubrick's drive was and his genius was. He was talking about, like, he made this analogy. He was talking about, um, he brought up the cautionary tale, the Flight of Icarus, where he's like, in some regards, like, we're we're told that the flight of Icarus is like a cautionary tale, where Icarus flies too close to the sun, and his wings melt because he's too close to the sun, because of his ambition or his desire to maybe achieve more, or to push himself beyond his limits, realizing that it could be his downfall. And he was talking about the flight of Icarus being a, a, uh, a cautionary tale, and that it's used. It's a mythological story that has been told through the ages about, be careful as far as like how far you can go, or how far you'll push yourself, or what you're willing to do to uh, in regards to your achievements. And he felt like, for him personally, the whole story of the flight of Icarus isn't a cautionary tale. He said the problem with that tale was that Icarus needed better wings. He needed to figure out a way of having these wings that were not going to be melted by the sun, and that he could have carried on and persevered. And I just thought that was so inspirational and so interesting. And for me, at the end of the day, just totally summed up the essence of what Kubrick was. And for me, gave me this inspiration that was, bigger than anything, as far as um, inspiration, not only through like your general everyday philosophy, but when it comes to creating art. Just amazing. And and I've always held on to that, and it's just an amazing thing. So this is Jason Dean. So I highly suggest, if you have not seen any Kubrick films, you got to check it out. Just such a genius in every way, a visionary director. There'll never be another Stanley Kubrick, as far as I'm concerned, and such a one of the most influential, iconic directors in history. But thanks again. This is Jason Dean. So if you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my page, and we'll see you next time. Peace.